Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Milrad. I'm the founder and president of Movie Karma, with a nonprofit organization that created our podcast, Rewriting Hollywood, which focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, and social impact in entertainment and in storytelling, really looking at the power of storytelling and how it can be used as a force for good and social change. Today, I'm excited to have a really unique and I think important interview and conversation with someone who is a leader on issues of inclusion, diversity, equity, particularly as it affects individuals who identify as Muslims. It's a really exciting individual who's got a new book out called Broken, the Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion. Her name is Professor Evelyn Alsultany, and it's a really important piece that was released in late 2022, this book, Broken, where Evelyn really walks us through how Muslims are only really included through crisis diversity, quote unquote, which is an institutional pattern of crisis response and then inertia to the next crisis. We've seen that certainly before. Professor Alsultany also is co-author of something called the Obeidi-Alsultany Test, which helps Hollywood improve representation of Muslims, and serves as she also serves as a consultant for Hollywood studios, and is a leading expert on issues of representation, particularly for Arabs and Muslims in the U.S. media. So really excited to talk to Professor Alsultany today. Evelyn, thank you so much for being on the show. It's really good to have you on.
Thanks, Jared. I'm excited to be here to talk to you.
Same here. As we were talking before we started, lots of overlap between what you're doing and what our podcast and our organization, Movie Karma, focuses on. So let's dive right in. First, Evelyn, I'd love to hear just a little bit about your background and your journey. If you would indulge us on, how you became, we're always sort of trying to illuminate for our audience, how you became and ended up doing what you're doing. So if you could tell us a little bit about your journey into researching and teaching and writing, how did that start to form for you?
So the short version is that I was born and raised in New York City. My mom was Cuban Catholic. My dad was Iraqi Muslim. And my mom passed away when I was little, and my stepmom raised me. She's Colombian Catholic. So I grew up with all these immigrants. I was raised Muslim. And I just remember, even in New York City, that's the most diverse city in the world. Every day we were asked where we were from. And at a certain point, my parents started lying about where they were from. So my dad would say he was from Turkey instead of Iraq. My stepmom would say she was from Spain instead of Colombia. And me at 6 years old, I was wondering, why are they lying about where they're from? And I just started noticing, when he says Iraq, he gets all kinds of questions about terrorism. He gets questions about how he makes his money in this really suspicious way. Whenever she says Colombia, we get the cocaine thing. So I was raised with this, and I also watched tons of movies. My brother and I were obsessed with pop culture, and looking back, we were watching Back to the Future with Libyan terrorists in it, and Indiana Jones with all these Arab buffoons.
Yes.
There just weren't any representations that I remember feeling embarrassed about my identity as a child. And when I got older, realizing, why would I feel embarrassed? There's no representation. I don't see myself on screen. And when I do, it's really bad.
Yeah. And so I guess, interesting, from a young age, you really felt that, and it was pronounced. I was born in New York City as well and raised there until I was about 10. I know. Yeah, it's interesting, as you say. I mean, it's incredibly diverse. At the same time, there are still all of the societal issues present, if not more so, in forms of discrimination and oppression and exclusion. So as you, I guess, came to realize that you were not being represented in media and television, film, what made you want to go into this space of sort of researching and talking about these types of issues? And did you feel like you pivoted towards it later, or were you always interested in kind of this type of academic or research area?
The question that was really driving me in terms of my academic pursuits was around how to understand Arab identity in relation to race, because the US Census says Arabs are white. My experience growing up was not one of whiteness, and I was looking at universities when I was an undergrad, where can I learn about this? And you couldn't. If you wanted to learn about Arabs, you went to Middle East Studies. If you wanted to learn about Islam, you went to religious studies. You couldn't go to American studies or ethnic studies for this. So that was the beginning, but the shift to popular culture happened right after 9/11. I was in grad school, and I was surprised to see turning on the television, more representations of Arabs and Muslims as patriotic Americans. I had expected more portrayals as terrorists, and there was a lot of that, didn't go away. But there was a shift that took place towards more sympathetic representations, and I was curious about what was going on and started researching that.
Okay, so you started to research there, and I know you got your PhD from Stanford. You've been an associate professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC here in LA, and you've taught for many years as well, other universities, including University of Michigan. So you started to get interested in this research area, and like, tell us about some of those earlier days of being, involved as an academic, a researcher. My brother is an academic, and I know how challenging that space can be in terms of the research demands and how often the pay is not great when you're starting out.
Yes.
And you're also teaching. Like, talk us through some of the challenges of doing that and how you overcame, particularly in this space at that time, some of those challenges.
So one of the things that happened was that 9/11 opened a space for the kind of work that I wanted to do, because all of a sudden people were acknowledging, oh, wait a minute, Arabs and Muslims are being targeted. There's something here that I think when you say racialization, there might be something to it, whereas before it was irrelevant. And I'm in ethnic studies, so in the ethnic studies space, it was hard to have nation. And yes, to everything your brother has said, when you start out, you are underpaid. And there are a lot of demands to get tenure in terms of writing, and you're teaching all the time, and you have all the service, and you're trying to squeeze in getting the research done. So it is a very demanding space. But a lot of my journey has been around, where can I do this kind of work? And my work builds on some other scholars. One of them is Jack Shaheen, who was a professor of mass communications. He passed away a few years ago. He wrote a book called Real Bad Arabs: How Hollywood Vilifies a People, where he looks at 1,000 movies that Hollywood produced from the late 1800s until 2000, so about a century of filmmaking. And he says, out of those 1,000 movies, 52 are even-handed and 12 are positive, which really speaks to a very long history of stereotypical representations. Arab and Muslim identities have been co-produced, conflated, and only recently are we starting to see some disentangling of those two identities. But starting with his research, I've been tracking changes in representations over the last 20 years.
Amazing. And I want to dive into what you found, because I know our audience, I'm sure, really curious there. But let's do maybe some level setting for people listening, because I imagine there's some folks listening who might wonder, okay, you said Arab identities, Muslim identities.
Yes.
I think one of the things we need to do as a society is have more vulnerable conversations. So, like, what are the differences between those identities? What is your research sort of started to unravel in terms of how those identities are conflated? And yeah, just if you would walk us through some level setting on that.
I'd be happy to. So Arab refers to people who trace their ancestry to 22 Arab countries in the Middle East. The Arab League has a designation of the 22 countries, but they're in North Africa and West Asia. Iran is not included in those Arab countries, or Turkey, although they are Middle Eastern countries, but they're not Arab. And then Muslim refers to someone who practices the religion of Islam. Muslims are from all over the world. Approximately 15% of Muslims are Arab. And I think among Arabs, maybe 80% are Muslims. So there is a large overlap there. But if you're Arab, you can be Christian, you can be Jewish, you could be secular, you could be atheist, you could be Buddhist. So that's your ethnicity, and you can practice whatever religion. And if you're Muslim, the most populous Muslim country is actually Indonesia. And when we think about Muslims, that's not necessarily if you're in the US where your mind goes.
Right, which President Obama has talked about, given his upbringing in Indonesia. And we obviously heard terms like Arab Israelis, Arab. So that sort of hopefully clears up for folks the distinction. Okay, so thank you for that. So given the salience of Islamophobia, of, as you said, the lack of representation of both individuals who are Arab, individuals who are Muslim, and the conflating of the two, and the stereotypical representations when they do occur in TV and media. What tell us about sort of the research areas you've dived into, and I'm curious if you could talk, maybe connect to that, about the tests that you've helped to develop for hopefully evaluating representation or lack thereof, but also increasing and improving representation.
Yes, so I've really been concerned with what causes social change. We have this very long history of stereotypes. So what is driving any kinds of changes in representation and diversifying those representations? And I have found, so in the book, my main argument is that change happens through crisis, or at least that's what's happening recently. And I call it crisis diversity, which refers to an event taking place, let's say the Muslim ban, as an example.
Mm-hmm.
It exposes the problem of Islamophobia, people become aware of it, they're concerned, and it galvanizes people to action. And in the case of Muslim ban, it wasn't just people, it was institutions, organizations, including Hollywood. And so actually after the Muslim ban, we start seeing an expansion in representations of Muslims that is unprecedented in our history. It's a small opening, it's not a huge shift, but it is a really important moment. Before that, if we look at right after 9/11, which my first book explores, where we start seeing a lot of patriotic Muslims, some organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, they actually contacted the producers of 24 and said, hey, we're really concerned, we're after 9/11, if you keep portraying Arabs and Muslims as terrorists, it's going to add fuel to the fire. And so they ended up adding a patriotic Muslim or Arab character to counterbalance the stereotype. So a lot of my work is asking, is this even effective? I mean, it's better than just having the terrorists, but how far is it taking us? And my argument in the first book is, if you're learning about Muslims in the context of terrorism as good or bad, it's really not, doesn't really take you far. You're still having a story about terrorism. But after Muslim ban, and I do want to say that Muslim ban was galvanizing in a way that after 9/11, we did have a war on terror, special registration, Abu Ghraib prison, USA Patriot Act. There were many policies comparable to the Muslim ban. Muslim ban is not unique in any way. So I've been wondering why this response to Muslim ban that didn't happen with special registration, or these, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. People protested, but we didn't have corporations and organizations and Hollywood responding in the way that we've seen, and not just with Muslims, but after George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter, we've seen this shift take place. And so I think there's something galvanizing specifically about Trump because of the overtness of his racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ animus, et cetera. That when it was covert, so George Bush often said, Muslims are our friends, they're not our enemies. And then would pass policies that demonized and impacted their lives. So I've been looking at that, and I do want to talk about the test, but I was wondering if I could ask you if you've noticed this in your work in terms of crisis and diversity.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to comment on that. So let's start there. We have certainly noticed that. We were founded as an organization in 2020, really, and then sort of became an independent 501(c)(3) in 2021. But I've been doing this work in terms of diversity of inclusion in Hollywood and storytelling for almost a decade now, and we have certainly found that. I think both in terms of the willingness of corporations and sort of industry leaders to give and to get involved in the work that we're doing and others are doing in the DEI space in Hollywood, both in terms of their dollars, but also in terms of their time and resources. We definitely saw an increase in interest in 2020 and 2021, and definitely, I would say, a decline, unfortunately, in certain ways. Yes. I think there's also a marginalization, which I'm sure you've seen, a siloing of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It's something we talked about recently at our Rewriting Hollywood Summit, with some leaders in this space of, where the sort of the diversity, equity, inclusion folks are siloed. They don't get much resources internally at these corporations and entities. And then the support that the organizations are getting doing the work is also then kind of marginalized and limited. So, and I think we see that even in storytelling where, executives, particularly at mid-levels, are not historically diverse or inclusive. And then those that are from underrepresented backgrounds feel themselves marginalized. So you sort of have these like multiple layers. And I don't know if that tracks with some of what you've been finding. In addition to, of course, I should say the lack of transparency and kind of effective data and research on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, because you said an increase and then a decline. And that's what the crisis diversity term is trying to point to, that there's all this attention when there's a crisis, and then when it passes, the attention wanes as if there is no crisis. But
right.
Meanwhile, the crisis is telling you what's always been there.
Right.
And
right. No, that's spot on. I mean, I think that I think that's something we've certainly seen. And I think a lot of advocates have seen. So I guess a question back to you then was like, how do we navigate that as advocates of, and even audiences listening to this, who want to advocate for more representation and want to advocate for better representation of our Muslim and Arab communities? Like, how do we advocate for that in the moments of quote unquote non-crisis, at least as the industry sees it?
Yeah, my take with crisis diversity is that it can produce positive outcomes, but it is limited because we're not focusing on the root cause. So let's take Hollywood and the Muslim ban as an example. The crisis seemed to be the Muslim ban, but the real crisis is that we've inherited a system of representation that Hollywood's been producing, and Hollywood is not the only culprit. This is a larger societal issue, and they're just one piece of it. But Hollywood has produced representations not only of Muslims, but has marginalized many groups with severe consequences. So the solution is repairing a history of underrepresentation and misrepresentation, rather than responding to the hate crime, the policy. Like, those are opportunities to keep doing the work. They're reminders that the work is important. But I think, and a lot of Hollywood is doing, we see Disney redoing their classics and diversifying so it's not as if Hollywood's not doing anything. There's a lot of diversity work right now taking place. But the issue for me is not Muslim ban, it is history of representations and the impact. And in the case of Muslims, the impact is very severe. My colleague Sue Obeidi often says it's a life or death issue, which it is. When we consume images of Muslims repeatedly as terrorists, studies have shown that we are more likely to support war in Muslim majority countries. We're more likely to support restrictions on civil liberties on Muslims. So there are impacts. It's not quote unquote just entertainment. Similarly, there was a study done by 416 Labs of the New York Times over 2.5 decades that showed that when Muslims are reported on in relation to terrorism, that it's portrayed as if Muslims have collective responsibility. And that's part of the issue. It's not that we have, Hollywood stories about Muslims as terrorists, but we're expected to speak on behalf of all terrorism. We are supposed to take accountability for it. We're responsible for it. So what we want, like any other underrepresented group, is a diversity of stories so that the terrorist story is not the only one.
Right. And I imagine also diversity of stories that are told by storytellers and greenlit by executives who are from the communities in which those stories are told, right? Or ideally have a deep sensitivity and empathy around how those stories are told. Have you seen, is that part of it for you? And also,
Yes.
Have you seen progress in that way?
Yeah, so after the Muslim ban, there were two trends. One was to include more Muslim characters in existing storylines. So let's say Grey's Anatomy included Dr. Qadri, who was a Muslim woman who wore the hijab, and she became part of the cast for a few years. Or on NCIS Los Angeles, LL Cool J's character came out as Muslim. On DC Legends of Tomorrow, they added an Iranian Muslim superhero. So there were some shows that started including more Muslim characters, finally in context having nothing to do with terrorism.
Right.
And then we also have a handful of shows that were greenlit that are written by Muslims. So I'm thinking here of Hulu's Rami,
Yep.
Netflix's Mo, which is about a Palestinian American undocumented immigrant and his family. We Are Lady Parts is a show out of the UK, and Peacock purchased it, and it's about 5 Muslim women who form a punk rock band. Sort of on HBO Max is a Canadian show, and it's about a Pakistani transgender Muslim. And then we have Ms. Marvel on Disney Plus, which we have a teenage Pakistani Muslim superhero. So those 5 in particular, I think, show the future, and it's promising. I don't know where it's going if we only make progress during times of crisis. And there is one statistic that stays in my head. A study came out of USC's Annenberg's Inclusion Initiative that stated that they studied I think 2019 or 2017, a few years of Muslim representations, and said that 1% of characters were Muslim. And that 24% of the global population is Muslim. So we have the stereotype problem, we have the underrepresentation problem, and we do have this promising opening, but 5 shows are not going to fix a history of stereotypes.
Right. We're still not at the point where the percentage of characters that are not stereotypical, the percentage of representation matches the representation in society, which is what you mean, right? By saying underrepresented. We're still not.
Exactly.
Obviously, a lot more to unpack there. I do want to ask you about the test that you helped to develop, and tell folks who aren't familiar with any of these tests, that are out there. I think are really helpful. What is this Obeidi-Alsultany test? What does it do, and how has it really helped to hopefully improve representation of Muslims and others?
So the Obeidi-Alsultany test was inspired by other tests that are out there and available to Hollywood to help think through the question of underrepresentation and misrepresentation. The first was the Bechdel test, named after Alison Bechdel, and it is a test to measure representations of women. It basically says if you have 2 women on screen, are they talking to each other about anything other than a man? Right. Really highlighting this history of how women are portrayed. There is a Russo test for LGBTQ representation, a Duvernay test for racial representation, an Isla test for Native American representation, and there's also a Riz test for Muslim representation that came before our test. And the Riz test focuses on, is the representation of men as terroristic, misogynistic, representation of women as oppressed, highlighting these common stereotypes. Our test comes in a little bit differently. Rather than highlighting the stereotypes, it's basically saying, Hollywood, we see you trying and we want to help you do better. And so basically after the Muslim ban, Sue Obeidi, who is the director of the Hollywood Bureau at the Muslim Public Affairs Council, we were having some conversations. Hey, did you see on Lone Star 911, there's a firefighter. She's Muslim. She's amazing. Oh, yeah, but that scene where she was praying, she prayed long, and Muslims went nuts on Twitter. Hey, did you see Alison Abdullah? She's a Black Muslim prison inmate on Orange is the New Black. But yeah, her backstory is that she comes from a polygamous marriage and she's upset about it. Why are there's this amazing improvement, but either there's a mistake or you have to resort back to the stereotypes. So that's where we're entering. And so, yeah.
And looking to really try to elevate and support efforts at better representation.
Exactly, exactly. So it has 5 criterion to try to point out the pitfalls that we've noticed in these efforts to diversify and do better.
Yeah, that's amazing. I had the honor of meeting Sue. I think it was Sue Obeidi. I think it was back at the Impact, one of the Impact Summits at Sundance, and she's amazing. I know has worked in this issue for many years with you, and I just love that you're trying to encourage positive behavior, because as opposed to only just looking at negative. Have you seen more adoption or understanding of these issues because of the approach that you're taking? Like, do you think it's effective, and has it been kind of inculcated and used?
It's hard to say.
Okay.
I do think we're at a diversity moment right now where there is an opening. Sue and I both were comparing notes that we both got more consulting gigs in the few years after Muslim ban than ever before. So there's interest, but we'll see in terms of this crisis diversity. I don't know where we're going next. I'm cautious. I want to say cautiously optimistic, but we'll see.
We'll see, because how do you feel like we can keep up the momentum? I mean, building on like my question earlier, to sort of really start to shift Hollywood in a systemic way, because it does feel like, as you said, with the crisis, these sort of crisis moments, the moment of the George Floyd murder, these horrible things that happen, sort of Hollywood pays attention, or is forced to pay attention, and then, as you say, it kind of fades. Like, are there systemic changes that you think we should be advocating for to try to keep, to really transform Hollywood in a sense, right? To rewrite Hollywood, as we say here, in ways that are sustainable. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think there's a tension with Hollywood being a money-making endeavor and those of us who want good representations. But the good news is this stuff is making money.
Right.
Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians changed things. And also there were a series of movies that did poorly in the box office that were whitewashing characters, like Jake Gyllenhaal in Prince of Persia.
Right. Scarlett Johansson, I think, had one, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. Gods of Egypt with, I'm sorry, I'm blanking, but so we see there's been a shift away from whitewashing, at least at the time being, and that there is an understanding that you will make money having diverse casts and that you don't have to have a white male lead for everything. Right. So yeah, I think that's an important component of all of this. Sometimes I personally, doing this work and doing it for the purpose of a more socially just future, I get frustrated when I hear the arguments that it's good for business and it's good to make you a better employee in the world. And all of that is true. Studies have shown that. But for me, diversifying representations is about inclusion, experiences as human in the world. And it shouldn't be about profit and money and those kinds of justifications. But okay, in the space of Hollywood, if we have to make that argument, at least those arguments are true.
Yeah, they are true, right? And we see that, as you said, that these films and TV shows that are more inclusive tend to do better, right? I mean, from the evidence we have, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that you can sometimes make even more money if you actually do this in a thoughtful way. Yes. So I wanted to ask you on that point on the sort of the talent side of this, because we spent a lot of time sitting down with actors and writers and directors and creative talent who are underrepresented. Some of them have been on the show Muslim or Muslim American or Arab American. What are your thoughts or views on how we can get folks with those perspectives who are creative talent in these rooms, like in these writers' rooms, in these, points of decision-making authority? Some folks in our program have said, to your point earlier, like, let's have more superheroes and Marvel folks and others who are, just from these backgrounds who represent us, so kids can see themselves on the screen. Like, how do we keep building that pipeline, essentially, of talent so that we see that more?
So another really wonderful development in the last few years is that some organizations and individuals have created databases for Hollywood. So a screenwriter created an Arab American screenwriters database. You need a screenwriters Arab American, come to this database and take your pick. The Pillars Fund is a Muslim philanthropic organization, and they created a database of Muslim talent. In front of the camera, behind the camera, when you need a Muslim on your set, check out the database. The MENA Arts Advocacy Coalition also has a database. And then we have Sue Obeidi at the Muslim Public Affairs Council, who's running workshops for screenwriters, helping them develop their craft, connecting them to Hollywood. So it's not only an interest in Hollywood to do better and be more diverse, but there are also more resources to help Hollywood in that project.
That's amazing. I love that you called those out. Folks should check those out. whether they are in those communities or, look, as you said, looking for talent from those communities. There's also an effort afoot, I understand, to have MENA as a group, Middle Eastern, North African, and others included in, I know, like the Writers Guild and sort of other aspects of the industry, and really just called out as one of the groups of folks that are underrepresented. Is that correct? Is that something that's underfoot as well?
Yes, and Azita Ghanizada, who is an actor and who runs the MENA Arts Advocacy Coalition, she did get SAG-AFTRA to include a MENA box. And there are other efforts to get Middle Eastern, North African identity acknowledged as part of diversity, and not to put us in the white category. Some identify as white, some pass as white, but we're such a diverse community, and many are not white, do not pass as white, do not identify as such.
Right. So really just getting this industry and other industries, of course, to acknowledge and fully celebrate the panoply of human experience and allow for that diversity to exist.
Exactly.
I guess my last question for you, would you like to ask, Ellen, is just sort of on a positive note, what gives you hope on this topic? Like if you're looking, 5, 10 years, 20 years down the road, what gives you a sense of optimism? And maybe to that point, building what you just said, like what changes do you hope we do see, so that kids growing up now, maybe if they're having some kind of conversation like this, hopefully a better version of it 20 years from now, what they would be talking about? What makes you hopeful in those points?
What makes me hopeful is the media that I'm watching today. Even, I watched The Equalizer with Queen Latifah. When I was growing up, there was a white man who played the Equalizer. Now we have Queen Latifah, kicking ass on the Equalizer. Yeah. And I get so much joy seeing her in that role. I watch Love, Victor. We have a queer Latino teenage lead, and he has a friend, Raheem, who's an Iranian Muslim teenager who's queer also. Yeah. I started watching Beef the other day on Netflix, an all Asian cast. So, for me, I get a lot of joy just seeing diverse representations, even if it's not on my group. When I watched Pose, I was, blown away and knew I was watching something really special. And I do think to myself, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be watching this as a child right now. It is a completely different experience from what I grew up with. So that does give me hope.
I love that. And we'll leave it there. Professor Evelyn Alsultany, author of the new book, Broken, the Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion. You can get it right now. Also co-authored the Obeidi-Alsultany Test, Help Hollywood Improve Representation of Muslims. And really just inspired by all the work you're doing. And I hope we keep moving in this direction and push it even faster and farther than we've been going. So it was really an honor having you on. Thank you so much, Evelyn, for joining us.
I'm inspired by the work you're doing too, Jared. Thanks so much.